First of all, Marike, thank you, and Professor Powell for the invitation to speak to you and to address you. I don't think I quite qualify for the definition of a business leader. I'm quite too young for that. But I'll share with you some concepts and some of the journey. Due to strategic reasons, I won't be able to share with you some of the very exciting things we do in the firm, but I'll be able to share with you as much as possible. Second, in terms of the construction of the presentation, I'll start at a macro level with a theory of trying to understand change, because I think I want to expand on what Professor Powell said. I think it's important that with so many changes happening so rapidly, people read every new fashion business book and they jump on this theory. And I've always found it useful to develop a framework in which to view the world, because I think that informs the critical analysis that is required, and that people don't get swayed. I always say that when it comes to investments, I'm a fundamental investor because I'm not smart enough for technical analysis. But secondly, because I think fundamentally the market has to revert back to fundamentals, and the technicals are all noise, and you have to sort of cut through all of that and try to understand what is driving fundamentally value. In terms of understanding this change, a useful construct for me is the notion of creative destruction, the father of who is Joseph Schumpeter, which to my mind was probably the greatest economist of the 20th century. And I think creative destruction for a non-economist sounds a very convoluted and complex construct, but it's actually a very, very easy construct, and hopefully by the end of this you'll agree with me on that score. And if looking at Schumpeter's definition of what is creative destruction, it's simply the process in which old ways of doing things are destroyed and replaced by new ways. And hopefully I'll show you guys what it means in practice. And I think central to his notion of creative destruction was the notion that an entrepreneur is central to that. And in his first version of his theory, he spoke of Unternehmensgeist, which is enterprise, or ondernemingsgeest to the Afrikaans speakers. It's very central to that. His second version, I sort of disagree, because he said that innovation was also driven by large companies' R&D departments, and I think Facebook and Google displaces that notion that I think creativity is not necessarily driven by big corporations. I think a lot of, particularly in this new digital age, and I think that's the good news, is that that it's not just big companies with, I think it may have been true in the 30s and the 40s when there was a shortage of capital. It's not true today. The second problem that you have with big companies is none of you would probably remember who was the leading stagecoach companies in the 19th century. And the reason is that when change is disruptive, the incumbents very seldom will. If change is gradual, then the incumbents or the market leaders normally prevails. But when change or technology is so disruptive that it redefines the business rules, the incumbent leaders in an industry do not prevail. And the simple reason I'll hope to explain later is my own view on it is that when people do the economic analysis, they use an old paradigm or framework, and then they say that this new technology doesn't work. It can't make money, and you then have within the firm resistance, efforts at undermining the shift to adapt to the new technology, and that normally kills it. But that's sort of more philosophical view on the issue that I have. The second point I'm trying to make is in this notion of the digital revolution, people often say media, print media is dead. And I think the problem with looking at the digital revolution as purely just internet and mobile, I think limits and inhibits the span of our thinking, because the way I look at it is you have to see it on the same basis as the Industrial Revolution. So first of all, it means you're talking about a 100, 200 year span. Secondly, it's going to fundamentally redefine everything we do, the way we live, how society operates, etc. Nobody could have foreseen that the Industrial Revolution was really triggered by the discovery of the printing press. It had such a fundamental knock-on impact on society, because one of the big changes that it brought about was the fact that knowledge became accessible to the masses. Because up to that point, only the wealthy people could afford books, because books were handwritten and therefore very expensive. And by making books cheaper, knowledge became accessible, and that reconfigured society. Look at this digital revolution as something fundamental as opposed to purely limited to either devices or particular technology. And effectively, this is what this is also demonstrating, is that, and this is also fundamental impact for your businesses, because new innovations are going to have a much shorter lifespan. For example, if you just think about cell phone technology, the first cell phones, the 1610s, the so-called brick, have become a museum piece in such a short space of time. Whereas if you look at the old landline handsets, for how long weren't those in use in our homes? 20, 30 years. Often people the same handsets. To summarize this issue is that I found this to be a very useful construct in looking at the world, because that's why I agree that a lot of the analysis are snapshot. It's who's the latest business book author, and everybody's running around. As a general rule, I actually don't read business books, because there's very little I can learn that my father didn't teach me. It's about very fundamental understanding, so I don't know if that discourages you from attending these courses. But this issue of social networking is important, and I think it's going to be one of the most important factors that drive democratization of societies. And we've seen it already in Iran with those protests about 18 months ago. We saw it in China last year. Because you can close down as many websites as you want to, and as fast as the new ones will. And so if you want to protest, arrange a protest march, it's much easier to communicate through Twitter. Last year when we had the beaching of these whales at Noordhoek, there were 250 tweets like within a very, very short space of time. I think the news was out on Twitter way before it hit News 24, which was pretty fast out of the blocks, I would imagine. People always ask me, why do we have open systems? Why do we let people experience social networking at home and we don't put limits on it, at work? The simple reason is we're a media company. We want people to experience social media. And you can't say you want people to publish these things and you don't have experience. And so one of the big drives has to be in our country that we, 98 we were one of the top internet nations in the world. We're now number 160 odd. And I think there are some players in the industry that's responsible for the dire state, because we haven't pushed broadband as fast as we should have done. So what are some of the key themes that's emerging? Clearly, there's better computing distribution technology. Media consumption behavior is changing. I'm looking at the nephews and nieces in our family. They're sitting in front of a television, but they're not watching television. They are busy with Twitter, or they're busy with, Mixit. And so many of us that are running businesses aimed at these people don't understand that these consumers are different. They're multitasking. But it also means that the attention span is much, much shorter. So you can't give somebody, people, in this attention economy, you have to compete for people's time, because they're bombarded with information. There's a lot of things competing for their time, but also how we interface. There's no such thing as you can sit behind your desk and you open your textbook and you concentrate on that. These people are interfacing. It's almost like when you have your computer screen open with different sheets, consuming and moving between these things quite rapidly. So it's cheaper, better computing and distribution technology. That's very clear. Media consumption patterns are changing, and they're changing quite rapidly. Most of us that are still reading newspapers are also consuming the news electronically. I go to our site News 24 a couple of times a day and see what's happening. And Facebook is wonderful. It gives us a sense of what's happening in the firm, because people post, so you can see if there's a problem. I discovered last week, I phoned up the divisional CEO. Some of our colleagues were on the blue train for team building. I said, that's interesting. Tell me more. So it's quite useful, actually. And then media and internet companies are reacting and responding differently. Some are investing in content, some are vertically integrating. There's strategies of geographical diversification. Some are going for gaming. Some are focusing on online displays. So the one thing that I've learned looking at different models in different countries is that two things. Is that first of all, there's not a blueprint. Different models for different markets. The second problem that I must have, that I have as a South African, is that with traditional media, we could often have visibility because we were 2-3 years behind, whether it's fashion or whether it's media, etc. So you had visibility as to what's happening, say, with lad magazines or what's happening with newspapers, and you would normally expect those trends to manifest here. Problem with mobile is we're one of the leading nations in mobile. I mean, we pioneered pay as you go. The difficulty that we have in terms of this space is there's very few blueprints to look at. And it means that there's far greater pressure on management teams here to be innovative and to figure out how we're going to make money from this new world. I think that voice calls, telcos won't make money in 5 or 10 years' time from voice. There has to be data. Today, 8.6% of all global calls is on Skype. I mean, when I travel overseas now, I don't have to go through Vodacom. I've got a wireless, push my Skype number, and I make an international call at a fraction of the cost, disintermediating the telco carrier. So the money has to be in data. It's not going to be on voice. I've referred to the very successful launch of the Apple iPad. I forgot my one at the office this morning. It's really a wonderful device, and it's the first device that gives me a lot of hope for traditional print products, because if you look at Sports Illustrated or you look at the Wall Street Journal, which I always prefer the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal because I hate those pencil drawings in the Wall Street Journal, but if you look at the quality of the Wall Street Journal on this iPad, I mean, it's really stunning. Video clips embedded, etc. So the user experience is just so much richer. Perhaps just in summary, in terms of the implications, is that the media value chain of the future will look very different. It will move away from these verticals to cutting across different verticals, internet space, mobile certainly will be big, etc. Change is a journey. It's a never-ending journey. And secondly, when you talk about change within a firm, it is totally integrated. It affects every person in the firm, it affects every activity in the firm, it affects every division in the firm. It's not about the innovative thoughts, but how to get the old ones out. And coming back to, say, this whole notion of change, if change is incremental, why big firms prevail, and if change is disruptive, why they don't prevail, is, let's say you have a traditional business model. Now you have digital, which means that the rules of the game changes. People always look at this, they say you can't make money. People have changed. It's about individualization, it's about customization. Now that goes fundamentally against an industrial revolution, which is about mass production and scale. Last point I want to make, one of the biggest challenges any firm, any place in the globe is going to face in the next 10 years is skills. And if you don't invest in the people, if you don't get the people to change the culture where people park their brains at the door when they enter your building, make them participative, but also stretch them, I think you're going to have severe challenges and uphill. But that's my story. Thank you very much for indulging me.